There's a famous story from Vietnam of a forward air controller, call sign Buzzard 01, searching the Ho Chi Minh Trail for truck convoys. Shortly after he arrived on station, he got a call from the fighter bombers fragged to him. Buzzard 01, flight of two F-100s checking in. The FAC was not happy. Two F-100s? I thought I was getting four F-4s. Buzzard 01, came the reply. What would you prefer? 4 bombs on the target or 24 around the target? In a nutshell, that's the story of the F-100 Super Sabre, the Hun, a thoroughly underrated and underappreciated combat aircraft that began as a record-smashing supersonic fighter shortly after the Korean War, but found its place as a precision close air support weapon in the cauldron of Vietnam. Because of the trouble in its gestation and the length and intensity of its service, the F-100 requires in-depth treatment. In this video, I'm concentrating on the single-seat F-100 day fighters. Misty, Wild Weasel, and Slick Chick are in separate videos. I've linked to those in the show notes. North American Aviation were only just getting their F-86A Sabre into production when it became clear that in a few years it would be rendered obsolete by supersonic fighters. The F-86 had been a considerable leap of faith for the company. It began as a straight-winged fighter before the end of the Second World War, but realizing that it would never offer the performance the Air Force wanted in that configuration, North American's management took a big risk and they sanctioned the installation of an experimental 35-degree swept wing. This transformed the aircraft and the rest is history. On the 3rd of February 1949, though, engineers at North American began working on a supersonic version of the Sabre, or rather one able to go supersonic in level flight. That was easier said than done. The only aircraft to have flown beyond the sound barrier had done so momentarily. Bell's X-1 had been supersonic for less than an hour by February 1949. The aerodynamics of supersonic flight were thus imperfectly understood, with more data gaps than data. In fact, there weren't even the necessary instruments to determine the forces, pressures, drags, lifts, and so on. Even supersonic wind tunnels were scarce. North American themselves were in the process of commissioning their own such facility in 1949. Their first idea was to fit an F-86 with a 45-degree swept wing to reduce drag. It soon became clear in the wind tunnel tests of scale models that this concept wouldn't work. The fuselage was simply too draggy at transonic speed. Changes to the fuselage improved matters somewhat, but it was apparent that a fresh approach would likely be more efficient than attempting to modify the existing F-86. While this was going on, in August of 1949, GE came to North American to show them their proposed J47, an engine with 9,400 pounds of thrust dry and 13,000 with afterburner. The then production F-86A only had 5,200 pounds, so you can imagine the potential for much higher speed flight that the J47 hinted at. North American's designers initially focused on fitting this engine to a modified version of the afterburner-equipped F-86D Sabre Dog. Their unsolicited proposal to the Air Force in August 1950 described a single-seat transonic all-weather interceptor with a radar, a 45-degree swept wing and an area-ruled fuselage. The Air Force rejected the proposal and suggested that North American design a day fighter instead. This was a good call. The Sabre Dog concept of a highly automated radar-equipped single-seat night fighter with rocket armament was rather flawed as a weapon system concept, and it was just too complicated for the technology of the day to execute. Later in the 1950s, Canadair would experiment with a Sabre modified with an area-ruled fuselage and discover that it didn't actually enhance performance substantially anyway. A transonic fighter was a transonic fighter. North American's second proposal in January 1951 was the advanced F-86E. This retained the wings, tail, and power plant of the advanced F-86D, but had a redesigned, slimmer fuselage and a nose inlet. The Air Force also rejected this, now suggesting that they redesign it as an air superiority fighter rather than an interceptor. The third proposal was a further reworking of the two previous concepts, named Sabre 45. Sabre 45's main change was to fit Pratt & Whitney's new J57 engine with 15,000 pounds of force in afterburner. Wind tunnel testing also demonstrated the need to move the horizontal tail from the base of the fin to a position low on the rear fuselage. This benefited stability and control at high angles of attack. North American's May 1951 submission described an air superiority fighter armed with 4 M39 20mm cannons. Maximum takeoff weight was 28,632 pounds, more than double the F-86F, which tipped the scales at 13,791 pounds. The Air Force was happy with this proposal. North American asked for funding for 2 flying prototypes, one for aerodynamic testing and one for weapons system development. North American believed that this would accelerate service introduction. Their views on acceleration in the Air Forces were somewhat different. In the late 1940s, Generals Lawrence Craigie and Orville Cook had studied ways of reducing the lead time between programs starting and achieving initial operating capability. They suggested that rather than building sequences of prototypes prior to production, the first prototype should instead be service aircraft made with production factory machinery, but in initially smaller batches. Faults could be fixed by modifying the early production aircraft as flight hours clocked up. This concept would not prove to be such a good idea. In the case of the Sabre 45, the Korean War was ongoing and the Cold War was hotting up. New fighters were needed to turn back the tide of communism. So the Air Force Council therefore recommended that the aircraft be bought in quantity immediately. On the 1st of November 1951, they ordered 2 hand-built prototypes, and they paid for the engineering design, production tooling, and purchasing of long lead items for 94 more. 8 days later, assessment of the full-scale mock-up was completed. The Air Force asked for 3 major changes from the mock-up. They wanted single-point fueling to reduce turnaround time on the ground, modifications to the artificial feel of the control system, and 275 rounds rather than 200 rounds per gun for the cannons. In the end, single-point fueling wasn't included, but other changes were made. For example, the hydraulic control systems were separated to increase survivability to battle damage, and the tail skid was replaced by a flimsier retractable item, saving £60. On the 7th of December 1951, the Air Force inaugurated the Century series by christening their new fighter the F-100A. But if you thought the design process was now complete, you would be wrong. It was 6 months before North American came to a design that they believed would make an effective combat aircraft. This version had an even higher fineness ratio for the fuselage, an extended canopy, and the horizontal tail lowered further. The Air Force did approve this new design, but insisted that the self-sealing fuel tanks North American had specified were replaced by conventional bladder tanks. This saved £400 in weight, but inevitably reduced the F-100's ability to take battle damage. More wind tunnel work at NACA with this design led to the nose being extended 9 inches and the rim of the intake duct being made even finer. These changes were incorporated on the first 2 prototypes. A third change to the thickness to chord ratio of the tail was too late to be made on the prototypes, and it had to wait for production. The YF-100 prototypes were 45.6 feet long with a wingspan of 36.8 feet and 376 square feet of area. At maximum takeoff weight, it weighed 28,561 pounds, propelled by 13,200 pounds of force from the prototype XJ57-P7 when using the afterburner and 8,700 pounds of static thrust. Going front to back, the oval nose intake was intended to provide the requisite airflow while also improving visibility over the nose at landing. The intake then ran back under the pilot, again reducing the depth of the fuselage through its flatter profile. Most of the avionics were contained in a bay ahead of the pilot. The fuselage is unusual for a US fighter of the era in that it isn't area-ruled. The cockpit canopy was considerably more fed into the fuselage than on the previous F-86, exchanging visibility for improved aerodynamics. In production examples, 4 M39 cannons were below the cockpit and the ammunition cans were behind. An A4 gun sight calculated lead based on range and relative movement data from the same AN APG-30A radar found on late model Sabres. It was a reliable system, if technically unimpressive compared to the technology carried in later Century Series aircraft. The low-mounted 45-degree swept double-skinned wings have inboard ailerons to reduce wing twist. These enabled a roll rate of up to 200 degrees per second at Mach 1. The wings have no dihedral. No wing flaps were fitted, but there were 5 slats running along the entire leading edge of the wing, which deployed automatically based on the air mass hitting them. The slats generally improved low-speed handling, increased lift for takeoff, delayed stall-induced buffeting, and improved lateral control near to the point of the stall. They also enabled tighter turns when maneuvering, essential given the compromises in maneuverability required to give the F-100 supersonic performance. There were only 2 wing hardpoints intended for the carriage of external fuel tanks. Continuing aft, the main fuel supply was contained in the fuselage. 5 bladder tanks held 750 US gallons. For comparison, the F-86 had only around 400 gallons, although some variants had a little more in their wing tanks. Most of the rest of the fuselage was taken up by the mighty Pratt & Whitney J-57. The engine was the only item in the package that had been developed with government funds. How the world has changed. The J-57 was a pioneering design featuring a split 2-spool 16-stage axial flow compressor with 9 low-pressure and 7 high-pressure stages. The 2 spools were mechanically independent and they could spin at different speeds, enabling the Goldilocks combination of more power via higher pressure ratio alongside lower specific fuel consumption. B-52s used water injection on the J-57 to give 2,000 pounds or so of extra thrust, hence the black smoke trails on takeoff. In the F-100, the J-57's 14-foot length was extended with a 20-foot-long 5,000-pound afterburner. For those of you on metric, that's 2.3 tons of burner. These were the early days of afterburners. The F-100s was an all-or-nothing design. It was either off, or a maximum of 2 seconds after the pilot selected it by selecting it on the throttle, it was fully on. A later pilot described the F-100 afterburner as the biggest, blackest afterburner nozzle in aviation history. The engine could be started either via air pushed in with an external power cart, or using a rather crude black powder-based starter cartridge that resulted in a billowing cloud of toxic smoke. The large, hydraulically actuated barn door speed brake was fed into the belly just ahead of the main landing gear wells. The characteristic swept tail surfaces at the back were all flying, as pioneered on the F-86E. It was the fin that would cause the worst of the F-100A's early problems. In the YF-100, the fin was enlarged over the comparatively small fin intended for production aircraft, which also featured a very fine thickness-to-chord ratio. This would make the F-100A even faster by reducing drag and weight, but it exacerbated the fact that the Super Sabre was a long, heavy aircraft with small control surfaces. Right at the back, there was a drag chute to reduce the landing roll mounted on the bottom of the fin. Packing it back in would be an irritating chore for maintainers, as its location meant a degree of contortion was needed to access it. The box you see on production aircraft about 2/3 of the way up the fin contains landing lights. The YF-100A was a handsome aircraft. Making it pushed the manufacturing technology and capacity of the most advanced industrial economy in the world to its maximum. Previous jet fighters had been made in a relatively traditional manner. Their light frames effectively shaped the load-bearing skin. That manner of construction was no longer adequate given the stresses imposed by supersonic flight and maneuver by heavy aircraft. Stronger, load-bearing frames were now needed. In order to prevent weight rising uncontrollably, that meant more complex structures made of more advanced materials. By way of example, an F-100 wing spar weighed 60 pounds when ready for installation, but it started life as a piece of bar stock weighing 800 pounds. 93% of the starting material was machined away to make a light but strong structure. Further complications were imposed by the heat generated by more powerful engines. Aluminium just wouldn't work for the fuselage elements around the J-57's afterburner section. It would simply melt or burn. Stainless steel had the thermal resistance but was far too heavy for it to be used in large sections. So the North American designers specified titanium, which has the same thermal resistance as steel but is 40% lighter. The Super Sabre used 6 times more titanium than the F-86D Sabre Dog, which was the first North American aviation aircraft to use the metal. With 650 pounds of the stuff in the aircraft in 1953, North America used 95% of the titanium alloys produced in the US. This did fall in 1954 as production ramped up, but only to 60% of the total supply. In the process, they discovered that much of the titanium alloy produced was of insufficiently consistent quality to be used for precision components. And with titanium being notoriously hard to work, they also had to invent a new generation of machine tools, right down to the lubricants used to ease and cool drilling operations. Things didn't stop with titanium either. Light and strong aluminium honeycomb was used to an unheard of level. 77 square meters of that were needed, versus 18 on the Sabre Dog. Significant investment in heat forming tools was the result. It wasn't just new tools for new materials. Because of the strength of the components and the need for precision panel gaps and overall fit, there was no longer a place for making things within a loose tolerance so they could be jiggered into place. Everything now had to be perfect. More tools and a sea change in factory assembly processes were needed. All of this change also impacted the vast network of subcontractors that supplied North American and the other aviation companies. In large part, the F-100 program started the process of dragging the US aviation industry from the ideas and processes of the Second World War to those of the 1950s. The result of this work was a fine-looking aircraft. Although the conceptual lineage of the F-86 is there in some of the Super Sabre's fine details, it immediately made its illustrious predecessor look like the past in every respect. And now it was ready for flight. The YF-100A was completed on the 24th of April 1953. Its first flight was scheduled for the 25th of May. George Welch, World War II ace and destroyer of 4 Japanese aircraft over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was the pilot. At the morning briefing, he bet Lieutenant Colonel Pete Everest, the head of the Air Force's Flight Test Operations Laboratory, a beer that he'd exceed Mach 1 on the maiden flight. Then, as he thought about it, he raised his bet to 2 beers. Needless to say that even with a detuned prototype version of the J-57, he quickly eased away from Everest, flying the F-86 chase plane. Shortly afterwards, the YF-100A broke the same barrier in level flight. Everest bought the beers. With some small modifications to its control systems, the YF-100A continued to set records. On the 6th of July, Welch took it to Mach 1.44 in a shallow dive from 51,000 to 20,000 feet. This is 1953, remember. The Air Force was unconvinced by the extravagant praise coming out from North American, so they sent some of their test pilots out to fly it. Their opinion was that the Super Sabre had potential, but it wasn't yet ready for operational use. Visibility was poor over the nose on takeoff. Longitudinal stability in high-speed level flight was unacceptable, as was low-speed handling. The aircraft wanted to yaw and pitch near the stall point, and it liked to drop the left wing in an uncontrollable manner. This effect was due in part to the angular momentum of the spinning blades in the engine destabilizing the fighter. Because of these effects, landing speeds were too high overall, and in combination with the poor visibility from the cockpit, night landings were dangerous. Final approach in the A was flown at 165 knots. In level flight, the aircraft was judged to be effectively impossible to trim, requiring the pilot to constantly make adjustments. Formation flying was unacceptably difficult. On his first flight of the F-100A, North American test pilot Joseph Lynch complained that the only time the ball was in the center was when it was passing through to get to the other side. There were other fundamental issues too. Performance was sparkling with the afterburner, but without it, the Super Sabre was sluggish. The climb to 40,000 feet took 16 minutes in military power. The various stability issues also made it a poor gun platform despite the significant hitting power of its cannons, which I'll get to a bit later. Pete Everest wanted the Air Force to delay the introduction of the F-100As that were already rolling off North America's lines, but the company protested. A combination of its powerful political connections and having TAC flyers, who were easily impressed by the F-100's speed, give their opinion led to Everest's report being shelved. Cook Craigie said that corrections would be made along the way and that everybody should stick to the plan. George Welch was amongst those who would pay for that decision with their lives. Once the first prototype was returned to North American, They got about fixing some of the most egregious issues while also ploughing headlong into production of the second test item and the near simultaneous production of the initial batch of F-100As. And to that end, from September 1953, the first F-100A Super Sabres were assigned to the 479th Day Fighter Wing at George Air Force Base in California. The predictable disaster finally struck on October the 12th, 1954. Welch had gone up that morning in the 9th production F-100 to test the structural limits of the aircraft in a 7.33G pullout from a dive at Mach 1.55. Having been unable to get to the intended parameters, he went up again in the afternoon. A passing B-47 crew observed his aircraft roll over into the dive, and shortly thereafter saw an orange explosion and 2 parachutes descending to the desert floor. Welch was recovered, still in his seat but critically injured. He died in the helicopter on the way to hospital. He was just 36. His F-100 had been extensively instrumented for the test, but the severity of the incident had badly damaged the recorders. Repair and forensic assessment began, alongside interviews of nearly 200 witnesses and collection of debris from the ground. This process took time. Accidents continued in the interim. On the 8th of November, Air Commodore Jeffrey D. Stevenson, a very experienced RAF officer in the US to test the Super Sabre, was killed when pilot-induced oscillations caused his aircraft to break up over Eglin in Florida. The following day, Major Frank Emery had to eject from an F-100A during a gunnery exercise when it unexpectedly departed controlled flight. After 6 crashes and 2 fatalities, all Super Sabres were grounded. With painstaking work, including restoring a severely damaged oscilloscope and camera footage from Welch's accident, North American discovered what happened. As was the usual procedure, Welch had rolled into his dive from level flight. Even as he executed this normal maneuver, the ball of the turn and bank indicator went off center, showing that the F-100 was yawed. Although Welch leveled his wings for the dive, the ball never returned to the center. The aerodynamic forces that provide directional stability decrease as Mach number, lift coefficient, and yaw angle increase. The extensive flight test program had already demonstrated that the F-100's directional stability was poor at any speed. Welch's pull-up therefore brought together all of its problems in a few tragic seconds. The Super Sabre was at a high Mach number, a high angle of attack, and it was yawed. It began to yaw further, beyond the capacity of the smaller vertical tail to compensate. Suddenly it pitched down and went out of control in all 3 axes. The physical forces exceeded the strength of the aircraft structure, and the supersonic air literally blew it apart. Its nose folded over the windshield, crushing Welch in his seat and causing the ejection system to fire. The vertical fin broke away. Welch was peppered with shrapnel as he fell. The initial remedy to these problems was to increase the size and thickness of the fin, giving 27% more vertical tail area, and to increase the wingspan from 36 feet 7 inches to 38 feet 9 inches. Wing area increased from 376 to 385 square feet, and total height increased by 6 inches. The 70 remaining F-100As that had been made before the need for changes was realized were modified with a new tail and extended wings after construction. Subsequent updates introduced yaw dampers that used a gyroscopic system to even out control inputs above 200 knots. They were activated via a button in the cockpit. Below that speed, the pilot might need to use large control inputs and didn't want the system interfering at the wrong moment. The grounding order was lifted in February 1955. Days afterwards, North American test pilot George Smith was at the factory on his day off. He agreed to give a brand new F-100A its initial test flight to help out. At 35,000 feet, the control column locked up due to a hydraulic system fault, described in the post-accident report as minor. Everyone's definition of minor is different. With the F-100 in an uncommanded dive at 780 miles per hour, Smith ejected. 5 seconds later, the Super Sabre smashed into the sea as a result of the minor problem. Smith was severely injured and lost 28 pounds in weight during his recovery, but recovery did. thus becoming the first man to survive a supersonic bailout. This achievement is made more remarkable by the fact that his chosen attire for the test flight was Levi's and a sports shirt. While we're on the subject of the Super Sabre's role and yaw instabilities, it's probably sensible to talk about the Sabre dance. Before I do, I think it's important to say that the famous video of the dance also documents the last moments of First Lieutenant Barty Brooks. Brooks was acting as a ferry pilot on January the 10th, 1956. He had 40 hours on the F-100 and was thus rather inexperienced with it. Most of his flight hours were on F-84 and F-86s. That afternoon, he and two colleagues were delivering 3 factory-fresh F-100Cs 10 minutes from Kelly Air Force Base in Texas to George. During the walk-around, Brooks missed something that a pilot more experienced with the type would have checked for. The nose gear pivot pin had been removed by the ground crew when they towed the fighter. This disconnected the torque link from the nose gear scissors. In this instance, they had failed to reinsert the pin fully. As he approached George and lowered the landing gear, the pin fell out, leaving the steerable nose gear to swivel at random. Fearing that the Super Sabre would swerve off the runway on touchdown, he went around and then decided to divert to the 15,000-foot runway at Edwards. Since there were test flights every day at Edwards, a film crew was present as Brooks lined up. Alerted that something was wrong by the racing fire trucks and rescue crews, they kept rolling and captured what happened next. Like the A, the C, which I'll describe in detail shortly, had no wing flaps. It therefore approached at a much higher speed than earlier fighters. Pete Everest had been worried about this combination of high approach speed, sluggish controls, and inexperienced pilots when he had attempted to get the program put on hold 3 years earlier. As the F-100 approached its relatively high stall speed, the tips of its highly swept wings stalled first. The stall progressed inwards, reducing the effectiveness of the ailerons and shifting the centre of lift forward of the centre of gravity. In turn, that shifting centre of lift caused the aircraft to pitch up and aggravated the stall further. And because this was the Super Sabre, the high angle of attack led to adverse yaw and roll coupling. A roll at slow speed and high angle of attack therefore produces unwanted pitch or yaw. It's a complex flight mode that really only the most experienced pilots had any chance of controlling. And remember that ejection seats at this time were not 0-0. They were not safe below a few thousand feet and 200 knots. At 4:27, Barty Brooks rounded the final turn of his approach. The fire trucks had sprayed foam on the runway to damp down the risk of a fire. Brooks saw that his descent rate would put him down before the foam and therefore raised his nose to alter his approach. He did not, however, add more power. Being a poor glider at the best of times, the Super Sabre's airspeed fell quickly and his wingtips began to stall. The wings rocked. Adverse yaw coupled in and the nose began to sway left and right as Brooks attempted to use ailerons rather than the rudder to stop the rolling motion. Realizing that he was below the power curve and the fighter's aerodynamic lift was no longer sufficient to keep it aloft, Brooks punched in the burner. Unfortunately, this raised the nose still higher without gaining any airspeed. In the video, you can see him attempt to lower the nose on 2 occasions to reduce angle of attack and fly out of the stall. The F-100 then rolled right, swerving across the runway and banking hard. The wingtip caught the ground, with fatal results. Brooks was killed instantly. The footage is horrible to watch. Its use as a training aid, however, saved numerous lives as it was a graphic demonstration of how the Hun was a rudder aircraft and thus how it should be flown at the edges of the envelope. Accepting that he should not have got into the low and slow flight regime in the first place, if Brooks had applied full power at the onset of the stall, accompanied by full right rudder, and then pushed as hard forward on the stick as possible when the nose rose and the roll began, then the chances are that he would have survived. Easy to say in hindsight and as an armchair pilot. That lesson allowed others to instinctively make the right correction and save their own lives, although other sabre dances did occur throughout the aircraft's career. Even with this lesson, the aircraft's accident rate was initially dreadful. There were 95 major accidents in the first 100,000 flight hours, which was the worst of any US type. Problems continued into the 1960s, by which point the average US aviator had become used to the vagaries of supersonic aircraft handling. There were pilots that deliberately made use of the Super Sabre's unusually severe yaw and roll coupling. Bob Hoover, the World War II US Spitfire pilot, apparently used to induce the Sabre dance during demonstration flights at Air Force and National Guard bases. He'd waltz it across the sky in front of the awed pilots and spectators. The rather controversial pilot and theorist John Boyd was famous for a maneuver he called flat plating the bird. In this, he would be in a defensive position with the adversary tight on his tail, both pulling heavy Gs. He would then suddenly pull the stick full aft, brace his elbows on either side of the cockpit so the stick would not move laterally, and then stomp the rudder. Observers reported that it was as if a manhole cover was sailing through the air and then suddenly flipped 90 degrees. The underside of the fuselage, the wings, and the horizontal stabilizer became a speed brake that slowed the Hun from 400 knots to 150 knots in seconds. The pursuing pilot was thrown forward, and now Boyd was on his tail, radioing guns, guns, guns. This is effectively a somewhat controlled version of the incident that killed George Welch. And again, it was not for the faint-hearted or the inexperienced. In all, 203 F-100As were delivered to the Air Force. 6 of them were converted into slick-chick spy planes. I've covered those elsewhere, and if I remember, a link to that video should be appearing in the corner. If not, it'll be in the show notes. F-100As were back in flight operations and in squadrons in time to participate in Operation Sagebrush in 1955. Even though the dampers had cured the Sabre's instability problems, it was not well liked in the Air Force because of its lack of range and flexibility. The question this leaves me with was whether the F-100A was a total disaster. I don't think so. At the very least, it should be recognised that the Super Sabre was a pioneering fighter. There wasn't a massive data and experience in truly supersonic fighters to draw from. The F-100 program was therefore building up the cutting edge of aerodynamics and aircraft engineering as they proceeded. The other overwhelming factor in the speed with which the A was abandoned was USAF doctrine. The Korean War was ongoing when North American Aviation proposed the Super Sabre. One of the great propaganda successes of that dismal conflict was Sabre versus MiG-15. Air superiority fighters were not just required at the time, they were the main characters in the US telling of the war and its conduct. Massive air power was a counter to massive communist numbers on the ground. But even before the YF-100's first flight, the Air Force was imagining a different type of conflict. In their imagination, proliferation of nuclear weapons would change the nature of conflict and of air superiority. Rather than mass dogfights, control of the air over a battlefield would be established by nuking the opponent's airfields first. Sagebrush was an early example of that doctrine in action. That meant fast, low-level nuclear strike aircraft on tactical offense and fast missile-armed interceptors able to attack from the front quarter playing defense. Notably, the only fighters in the Century series that were actually requested by the Air Force rather than proposed by manufacturers were the F-102 and later 106 interceptors, and the F-101 Voodoo, which was initially intended as an escort fighter, then was briefly used as a nuclear strike aircraft, and then as an interceptor for an extended period. There wasn't any way of adapting the F-100 as an all-weather missile-armed interceptor, but since it was a high-performance airframe with much of the capital investment done, it made sense to evolve it into a true fighter bomber, and thus a modern air superiority fighter. That was the specification for the F-100C, development of which started in 1951. Beginning in 1958, the F-100As were phased out of the frontline inventory and into the National Guard. In 1961, the Berlin crisis led to a brief recall of the type to active service. Partially as a result of the acute need for supersonic tactical fighters, the USAF decided to extend the A model's lifespan, with TAC actually keeping the aircraft after the National Guard crews had returned to the US. Eventually, 115 examples would be transferred to Taiwan, of which 80 were remanufactured into something approximating an F-100D. 50 A models had been destroyed in accidents, leaving only 35 in the US inventory. They were all attrited by 1970. The F-100A was the penultimate US Air Force tactical fighter built around a gun as its main weapon, the last being the A-10 Thunderbolt II. It was definitely the last air superiority fighter in the US built in this manner. In fact, it was the last pure USAF air superiority fighter that would enter service for 20 years. The gun system was an evolution of that found on the Gunval F-86F Sabres in Korea, and it was very similar to the installation on the F-86H Sabrehawk. It consisted of four 20mm Pontiac M39 cannons, each capable of firing 1,500 rounds a minute. After their teething problems were worked out by Ford, it proved to be a reliable and ferocious weapon. A battery of four gave the same weight of fire as the M61 Vulcan that superseded the M39 in the Air Force. In the F-100, the guns were mounted almost upside down with their barrels contained in blast tubes. Ammunition was fed to them from four magazines, to each side of the cockpit. 200 rounds was the usual load to prevent rounds cooking off. Some D models could safely carry 257 rounds per box, but for the A it was 200. The guns were manually charged on the ground before takeoff. They couldn't be automatically charged in flight. Loading was also manual, but could be accomplished very rapidly by an experienced crew. I've seen claims to the effect of 200 rounds loaded in 7 seconds. For air-to-air use, I believe the load would be a mix of high explosive incendiary and tracer. In Vietnam, HEI was the exclusive load for strafing. The cannons could be fired in pairs or all together. Expended links were retained in compartments next to the guns. Cases were ejected through tubes flush with the lower fuselage. Gun gas venting, often an issue with jet fighters of this vintage, was accomplished by doors that automatically opened when the pilot pulled the trigger to the first detent on the way to firing. They drew air from the intake and used it to purge the gun compartment, staying open for 5 seconds after firing had stopped. There was a micro switch in the system that detected if the doors had not opened and prevented the guns from firing. There was also a lockout that prevented them being fired with the gear down. In theory, you weren't supposed to fire below 250 knots because there wouldn't be enough airflow to vent the gun gas, but I don't think this was a cutout, more of an instruction to pilots. For completeness, the gun camera also operated when the trigger was pulled to the first detent. The camera had 3 settings: bright, hazy, or dull. Firing the gun using the A4 and the APG-30 combination required the right combinations of switches and dials to be operated in order. That process started by setting the wingspan lever so that it matched the size of the target. This didn't have anything to do with the radar ranging system, but it enabled the pilot to use manual ranging later if the radar were to fail. Once the target was in sight, the pilot pressed the caging button that stabilized the sight reticle and enabled target tracking to start. The pilot had to hold down the caging button on the top of the throttle lever and continue to track the target with some lead until the indicator on the lower left side of the A4 gun sight came on to show that the radar had locked on. The caging button could then be released, and the pilot was free to fire when he got the reticle lined up with the lead pipper. Doing all of this under pressure required a cool head. On the surface, the M39 battery looks like a powerful weapons system. It certainly was a major upgrade over the 50 caliber machine guns on the F-86, and it was also superior to the two 23mm and one 37mm cannons in the MiG-15 and 17. But when compared to fighters of its own vintage, it needs to be assessed against the Hawker Hunter, which had four 30mm Aidens, and the MiG-19 with three 30mm Noodleman Richter NR-30s. From a weight of fire perspective, both aircraft have more than double the hitting power of the F-100. Although the M39 boasts 20% higher shell velocity, neither of the 30mm weapons are exactly wanting in that department. Given the dynamic capabilities of the Hunter and the MiG-19, ultimately the F-100 was inferior to its peers as an air-to-air fighter. Only its fuel capacity really made it stand out against them. In fact, against the Hunter, this was the typical US tactic employed by pilots. They would use their supersonic speed to stay out of gun range, and then they would shoot the Hunters as they returned to base with bingo fuel. If you're not cheating, you're not trying hard enough. As a fighter bomber, however, no cheating would be required. The Super Sabre would prove to be the best of its generation. In the F-100C, North American responded to the needs of the Tactical Air Force by adding greater fuel capacity and enabling Super Sabres to carry more stores of more varied types. At this point, the F-100 was still, however, primarily regarded as an air superiority fighter, just now with secondary fighter bomber capabilities. Fuel capacity was a known issue for the F-100 before the YF-100A first flew. To that end, in October 1952, the Air Force asked North American to design a wet wing containing fuel for the aircraft. By March 1953, a workable design had been devised that put tanks in and filled any remaining spaces, spars, and bolt holes with sealant. In July, the Air Force inquired as to whether this wet wing could also have pylons added for external stores, and again this turned out to be feasible. On the 30th of December 1953, some people don't believe in a break between Christmas and New Year, the Air Force officially modified the F-100A production contract so that the last 70 aircraft would be produced with the fighter bomber capability. Because F-100B was already reserved for an in-development Mach 2 version of the Super Sabre that would ultimately become the F-107, the updated F-100 was the C. Modification of the fourth production F-100A into the prototype F-100C began in earnest. It wasn't feasible to replumb the aircraft for the wet wing, but otherwise this prototype was used to test all the systems of the new C, once the fin had been replaced with the higher one and the wings had been extended. The wing also featured 6 removable hardpoints for stores, which could be gravity released in flight if required. The inner pair in each wing were plumbed for drop tanks, although in practice it transpired that carrying 4 smaller drop tanks was less aerodynamically efficient than 2 big 450-gallon bags. Single point fueling was also added back in, reducing time and manpower required on the ground. The big range extending upgrade was actually in-flight refueling. Although this sounds relatively simple, it actually proved to be initially rather difficult to find a workable fueling setup for the Super Sabre. The first probe they tried was a short, straight, tubular detachable unit attached inboard beneath the right wing. This was a pain to use in practice as it was practically impossible to see the end of the probe from the cockpit. It could be seen if the pilot placed their helmeted head against the upper right side of the canopy. However, this made it very hard to fly in formation with the tanker. Remember that this isn't as simple as just flying up and connecting. The probe needed to be inserted into the drogue with sufficient force to engage it fully. As the fighter approached the tanker, wake turbulence meant that the aircraft, and in particular the drogue, bounced around in the turbulence. Attempting to line everything up while also looking over one's shoulder and using the stick in an unnatural position was beyond most pilots most of the time. If you missed, there was a decent chance that the whipping fuel hose and drogue was smashing up the side of the fuselage or the wing slats. If the pilot was unlucky, then he might get a smashed canopy, and worse was possible. On a practice run near Cannon Air Force Base, the hose trailing behind a KB-50 became entangled on an F-100's fin. As the fighter pulled away, the drogue hose broke. An inertia reel snapped it back into the tanker, igniting a fire. Fortunately, the 9 crew were able to bail out. The F-100 pilot whimsically painted a tanker silhouette on the side of his aircraft. Fueling was made even more challenging by the slow speed of the KB-50D tankers, which cruised at 200 knots. The F-100 crews perfected a toboggan maneuver in which both the fighter and the tanker were in a shallow dive during the refueling, enabling the F-100 to stay above its stall speed. Convenient it was not. In most C models, that fuel would flow into an uprated J57P7, which improved high-altitude performance by about 40 miles an hour. Time to reach 35,000 feet fell by about 10%. Because it was lighter and cleaner than the later D model, the C was the fastest Super Sabre and the most capable in a visual range dogfight. Updated electronic control systems and gyro dampers further improved stability in flight. Although capabilities had certainly been added, the F-100's air-to-ground potential was still somewhat limited. It had the MA-2 Labs system for delivering nuclear weapons, and the M1 bombing system for conventional weapons delivery, but it could only carry up to 5,000 pounds of dumb bombs or rocket pods, so the tactical options were pretty limited. Because the Air Force desperately needed more modern fighter bombers to replace F-80s and F-84Gs, an additional 230 F-100Cs were ordered in February 1954. The prototype flew in May 1954 and flight tests on it were completed by April. This resulted in further orders, bringing the total C models ordered to 564. In fact, demand for Super Sabres was so great that the Air Force worked with North American Aviation to establish a second production facility in Columbus, Ohio. 246 Super Sabres would be built there, all but 25 of those being D models. With mass production, unit costs fell to $450,000 at 1955 prices, about $5.25 million in 2024. In October 1954, the first wet-wing Sabre was completed, but the fleet was still grounded, so it wasn't until January 1955 that the first production aircraft took to the air. Deliveries to TAC began in April. Eventually, 476 C models will be built, with some of the initial contract being turned over to the F-100D. About a third of the aircraft went to Europe. Despite the availability of the AIM-9B Sidewinder from about 1956 onwards, F-100Cs were not wired for it from the factory. It was only in the mid-1960s that 125 Air National Guard Cs were upgraded to Fire Sidewinder. 6 Air Force aircraft were modified for it in 1956, but for some reason it wasn't rolled out across the fleet and was only wired into the D model from the 184th production example. Sidewinders could be carried singly or on a Type 9A double pylon on the inboard stations. The cockpit featured 4 lights to indicate to the pilot which missile would fire next in the left-right sequence. This pylon could also be fitted with a TDU-11 practice rocket dispenser that would shoot a 5-inch rocket out ahead of the aircraft so that the pilots could practice locking on and firing a Sidewinder at it. Most pilots tried this once, but as later experience would show, it was very different firing straight and level against a dumb target than trying to judge where the envelope lay in a turning fight with a MiG. In 1956, there were also trials with the GAR-2, later AIM-4 Falcon, but thankfully this never became operational. F-100Cs in Europe were tasked with nuclear strike. That is despite some prominent figures, such as Boots Blessé, resisting the tasking due to the safety issues of having an unreliable single-engine aircraft flying around over populated areas carrying a live nuclear weapon. The F-100Cs and later Ds were responsible for attacking any target in reach when carrying 3 drop tanks and an 1,800-pound Mark 7 special store on the left inboard pylon. They trained for a low-level attack profile to stay under Soviet radar, which had developed much faster than NATO expected. Super Sabres sat on daytime 15-minute alert from 1955 until around 1970, when the aircraft left the theatre. The F-100 sitting in their pens would have the bombs already loaded, but the pair of uranium cores were held in a locked storage room next to the pilot's ready room, and they would only be inserted by the pilots if the worst were to happen. To prevent the two spheres contacting and killing everyone through a burst of radiation, they were contained in a birdcage of aluminium rods that kept them separated by 2 feet. I think I'd have preferred to have been separated by a county or so, but there we are. An aircraft would sit alert for about 2 weeks. They were started up every day to make sure everything worked. In the event that a problem was picked up, then that aircraft would be stood down and another one would be brought up. If they'd been launched on the day of the apocalypse, the F-100 formations would have flown at 360 knots until they reached the ingress point. Then they'd have pushed up to 500 knots at about 50 feet of altitude. Each pilot would go on to an individual target, navigating from information held in the folders they'd be issued as they ran out to their jets. It's likely that multiple single flights would be directed at the same target in many instances, but the pilots weren't told that and they'd fly different courses. The bombs would be armed as soon as they crossed into communist territory. This was all hand flying and dead reckoning navigation under extreme stress. You can see why Blessé and others had reservations. Over the target, they would cut in their afterburners and begin a 4G Immelmann. The lab's display looked quite like that of the instrument landing system. The pilots needed to adjust for wind strength and direction and then keep the vertical and horizontal needles crossed to stay on the right trajectory. Labs released the weapon automatically so it would be lofted to about 20,000 feet before coming down fast on its target. The radar fuse was set to 1,500 feet so that the base of the fireball would be at ground level. The cockpit switch also allowed the pilot to select a ground detonation if he so chose. Apparently, they were instructed to arm the weapon if they were shot down over enemy territory and set the ground detonation so it would go off on impact. In general, though, the pilots were trying to maximize the effect of the heat, blast, and radiation of the bomb. Kicking up dust in a ground detonation created fallout, but it reduced the other effects and was thus to be avoided if possible. The closest the crews ever came to activating and flying east with their bombs was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. Crews in the UK were put on a covert alert status. Several crews were called and briefed in private. F-100s were loaded with live weapons in preparation. Priority targets like East Berlin were to be attacked by multiple F-100Ds and then followed up by Thor missiles. As the crisis reached its height, pilots were sent to their cockpits armed with Mark 28 nuclear bombs. Thankfully, the ships turned back and the world was saved. It was only in the F-100D that the TAC got the aircraft it wanted, which was a proper fighter bomber with a strong emphasis on the attack mission. 1,274 of this version would be built, representing 55% of the 2,294 Super Sabres. Structurally, the F-100D added a little more area to the vertical tail for increased stability. In order to cope with the additional weight of the package, landing flaps were added to the wing trailing edge, leading to the characteristic cranked wing look. Landing speeds were still high at 150 knots, but it had at least come down a bit. Another big change was the fitment of a heavy-duty pylon on the underside of the fuselage to accommodate the large Mark 28 special store. This meant modifying the speed brake for clearance. It also changed the setup for nuclear attack, allowing 4 tanks to be fitted for extended range. Although the centerline pylon was theoretically removable for aerodynamic reasons, it was generally left in place. The wings retained the 3 hardpoints per side of the C, but now with 4 ejectable pylons. The avionics suite became yet more advanced. The labs was now the ANAJB-1B. The A4 gun sight could now use radar ranging for conventional rocket and strafing attacks, and an MB3 autopilot was fitted for the first time. Its principal use was supposed to be with labs to automate pull-out, but it was not a very good system and it was usually disconnected. Apparently its favourite trick was to abruptly aim for the ground in level flight. The F-100D also introduced the low-altitude drogue delivery system for the first time. This offered an alternative attack profile that took advantage of new nuclear weapons that could be delivered in a high-speed run on the deck. When dropped, the bombs were retarded by a drogue parachute. A timer started when they left the aircraft, detonating the bomb after a preset time. The delivery profile for the weapons was to run in as fast as possible, then pull up to a higher altitude, at which point the bomb would be automatically released and the pilot could haul ass out of the blast radius, in theory. The D also had a near zero-zero ejection seat for the first time. Although it was capable of performing its duties at low altitude and airspeed, actually using that seat required cool thinking. Before punching out, the pilot was supposed to first stow loose equipment, then actuate his bailout bottle, which would take over his oxygen supply, stop-cock the throttle, lower his visor, brace himself in the seat with his heels on the footrest and head forced back hard into the headrest. He then pulled up one of the canopy latch releases on his seat. If that didn't work, then he held the canopy switch open, pulled the jettison lever, and allowed the airflow to pull the canopy off. As a last resort, he could tuck his head and go out through the canopy. Finally, he pulled one of the seat triggers. If he got out, then the seatbelt was supposed to automatically release about a second and a half later. He had to kick the seat away himself, and then pull the ripcord to open the parachute. Getting out at low level would have been unlikely. The box on the top of the tail now contained a tail warning receiver to guard against enemy gun-ranging radars. It was not, however, the more capable radar warning receiver that Vietnam experience would prove necessary. Store's capacity went up to nearly 8,000 pounds in this configuration. Overall empty weight also increased by 1,200 pounds, blunting some of the F-100's performance. The in-flight refueling setup was refined, and it could be used to fill the large 450-gallon ferry tanks. 200, 275 and 335-gallon tanks could also be carried in various combinations as required or as available. New KC-135 tankers also made life easier for the pilots. Entering service in 1956, the F-100D offered a flexible package. Its flight characteristics were now at least understood, although training had yet to fully catch up. 116 F-100s of all versions were lost in 1958 alone. There were, however, inevitable issues with the avionics in this new version. Rather than stop the line, the Air Force decided to just have North American fix them as they went or delay them for in-field upgrades. They soon regretted this decision. Few F-100 squadrons received a complete set of a single batch of aircraft. This meant that capabilities and even basic wiring differed across the fleet and made maintenance a challenge. And maintenance was already a challenge as the maintainers were undergoing their own in-depth program to give them the skills they needed to work on more high-performance, electronically complicated aircraft. In 1962, the Air Force therefore embarked on Project Highwire, the intention of which was to rewire 700 F-100D and C and two-seat F models to a common standard. That both included adding new systems to bring them to the same standard and removing redundant wiring, hence reducing weight and simplifying access. Cockpits were largely standardized at this point. Highwire was a time-consuming process that required 60 man-days of effort per aircraft and took until 1965 to complete. It cost $150 million, equivalent to purchasing more than 200 new F-100s. But finally, with Highwire completed, the TAC had turned their supersonic show queen into a weapon of war. And it was just as well, because its time had arrived. The first 6 F-100s deployed to Thailand in April 1961. By 1962, 18 F-100s were operating from Tak Lee, flown by pilots from various squadrons, who did 90-day rotations at the base. The specific F-100s remained the same, though, but the pilots needed to rotate in order to remain proficient. At this point, Tak Lee didn't have basic facilities for essential training exercises like shooting against the dart, let alone air-to-ground weapons delivery. Their activities escalated in the spring and early summer of 1964. An RF-8A on a Yankee team reconnaissance flight was shot down by the Pathet Lao on the 6th of June. The following day, an F-8D escorting another RF-8 was also shot down, and the decision to strike back against the AAA batteries was made. Poor intelligence and excessive interference from high up the US command structure made the first mission a bust, with half of the F-100s bombing an uninhabited patch of jungle 25 miles off target. Even so, the F-100 had now flown the first of 360,000 combat missions in Southeast Asia. In the early days, the F-100 was used as a true multi-role fighter. Alongside the obligatory drop tanks, it would carry Lao-3 rocket pods and sometimes AGM-12 bullpup missiles as an armed escort for recon flights, or a pair of Sidewinders as a bar cap. In August 1964, the first MiG-17s were spotted in North Vietnam, but in the early months they concentrated on training and proficiency, staying well away from the US strike packages. At around the same time, on the 18th of August, the first of 242 F-100s lost in Southeast Asia went down. Its pilot, First Lieutenant Arnie Clark, ejected safely. He was one of the lucky ones. 87 F-100 aircrew were killed in the conflict and 5 became POWs. 14 were rescued. Rather than give a blow-by-blow account of the F-100's still somewhat unheralded campaign in Vietnam, I think it's more useful to analyse what was learned about the type during the conflict. Few aircraft are subjected to such a long and arduous examination of their strengths and weaknesses. The F-100 fleet, which peaked at 490 aircraft in 1968, flew more combat missions in Vietnam than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs managed during World War II. F-100Cs, Ds and Fs were deployed, and they were flown by Air National Guard as well as regular Air Force pilots. The F-100 had of course originally been designed for air-to-air combat. During the early months of Rolling Thunder and before it, the lack of a better option in theatre meant that the Super Sabre had a rare taste of this mission. Encounters with MiGs were exceptionally rare though. The only encounter of note took place on the 4th of April 1965. At various points in a confusing melee that occurred during a major strike on the Dragon's Jaw Bridge, some of the 16 F-100s from the 416th Tactical Fighter Squadron fired AIM-9B Sidewinders and 20mm cannons at 4 attacking MiG-17s. Although the MiGs initially succeeded in turning in behind one flight of F-100s, they were poorly flown and soon attempted to flee as the Super Sabre pilots took evasive action. Captain Don Kilgus pursued a MiG-17 from 20,000 feet down to 7,000, scoring multiple hits. That MiG-17 crashed, but because it was not seen at the time, the kill was marked as a probable. Evidence from Vietnamese records released decades after the war confirmed Kilgus's kill, which was the only one scored by a Super Sabre. In exchange, the MiG-17s shot down two F-105s, although curiously 2 more MiGs were also lost. The VPAF also chalked these up to the US fighters, but it's more likely they were shot down by their own AAA. I've covered this engagement before on the channel, so I'll not drain it here. The link is in the show notes. The poor performance on April the 4th caused the Air Force to reconsider the idea that the F-100 could be an effective MiG cap. Although it had been intended as an air superiority fighter, North American and the Air Force had placed too much emphasis on supersonic speed. Further upgrades had added weight but not much more power. The F-100D weighed over 22,000 pounds empty. MiG-17 was a bit less than 8,500. Comparatively poor thrust-to-weight ratio meant that the Super Sabre was approaching a stall almost as soon as it attempted a tight turn, even when the wing slats deployed. It bled airspeed and it lost energy very rapidly. The MiG-17 could not only easily turn inside the F-100, but it could also outclimb the Super Sabre if both were at combat weight. Furthermore, the J-57 was unreliable in high angle of attack maneuvers. It would suffer compressor stall in both military power and when the afterburner was used, which it always would be in a close fight. And of course, the afterburner guzzled fuel at a prodigious rate. Ironically, the tactics that F-100 pilots had used against fuel-light hunters could be effectively turned against them by short-ranged MiGs operating close to their bases. On the plus side, despite their lack of practice, at this stage in the war, the average US aviator was a lot more experienced than his counterpart. VPAF's successes were often down to the ability of their ground controllers to place them in advantageous positions. I still see forum posts suggesting that the F-100 was an underappreciated air-to-air fighter, and actually a match for the Fresco and Farmer. I'm sure there were US pilots that flew all three of these, given that both the MiG-17 and Chinese-built MiG-19s were available via foreign military exploitation programs in the 1960s and 70s. If they are, or were, out there, their testimony isn't readily available. What is, however, are declassified Vietnam-era reports. The first of these were the 1965 test flights between a variety of US tactical fighters and Air National Guard F-86H Saberhogs during Project Feather Duster 1 and 2. The latter were the most representative aircraft the USAF had at the time for the MiG-17. We do have to be slightly careful in this, because the Hog is a significantly heavier aircraft than the Fresco. It was 5,000 pounds heavier when empty, nearly 60% more. At typical combat weight, the difference actually grew as the Hog carried a lot more fuel. Feather Duster found that the F-100 was actually the only one of the US fighters tested, including the F-4C, that had any chance of staying with the F-86H in a turning fight. But as I said, that's misleading when judging similar sorties against the MiG-17. The have-drill tests against captured Syrian MiG-17s in 1968 essentially said that the US F-100 pilots should under no circumstances attempt to get into any sort of turning fight with the MiG, as it had a smaller turn radius, greater turn rate, and retained energy better. Sabre pilots would haul ass at the first sign of trouble. Slightly earlier testing against the captured Iraqi MiG-21 in Havdonut gave the Hun no chance unless it managed to lure a fishbed into a transonic regime and escape while the MiG pilot was being shaken to bits by the buffeting. Irrespective of what we now believe about the F-100's potential as a visual range fighter, there was another issue, and a rather ironic one at that. The once red-hot Super Sabre was too slow to stay with the F-105s it was escorting. Even the F-4 struggled a bit, but could more or less keep pace. The F-4 therefore took over most MiG-cap duties after April the 4th, occasionally assisted by F-104s. F-100s never flew the mission again. Lack of speed and range also meant that they were restricted to action around the line of contact and in Cambodia and Laos, where they were less likely to encounter surface-to-air missiles and MiGs. But the F-100 was available in the theatre in some numbers, and so it was put to useful work. Fortunately, one of the things that was already known about the F-100, but perhaps underappreciated, was the precision with which it could deliver ordnance. Although there were many times when the pilots were called into action at a moment's notice, the average F-100 and pilot flew one planned mission a day, and that average day started 2 hours before takeoff with the mission briefing. They got the weather report, intelligence on the target, the purpose of the strike, and experiences from previous attacks in the area. Flight leads then gave the tactics and weapons briefings, as well as dull but essential information about how to contact the FAC, where the aircraft were parked, and when the crew bus was going to leave. About an hour before takeoff, the pilots put on their G-suits and Nomex coveralls. They stowed their personal belongings and loaded their .38 revolvers. On the way to the bus, they picked up their parachutes and 2 flasks of frozen water. The latter would have defrosted by the time they came off target. Then they got onto the crew bus and off to the parked F-100s for the pre-flight. Climbing into the ready F-100, the pilot cranked the J-57 by pressing the button for the external starter. He contacted his flight lead and taxied out as the smoke from the cart cleared. Takeoff rolls were typically long, given the heavy load of 2 big fuel tanks and 4 cans of napalm or bombs that the Hun would be lugging. 7,500 feet on the 10,000-foot runway was typical. The number 2 would be in his leader's warm air, and it would take a bit longer to get airborne. Once away, the Huns cruised to the target area between 15 and 18,000 feet. When fully loaded, they weren't really capable of getting much higher. Around the target area, they'd be handed over to the FAC, and they would orbit above them at between 12 and 14,000 feet, monitoring the radio. When the FAC marked a target, the F-100s would roll in and attack, one after the other. Exactly how they executed that attack obviously depended on how they were armed. Passes with napalm, slick bombs, or snake eyes would often be followed up with strafing. Snake and nape is the classic Hun load in Vietnam. Hun pilots often pushed their aircraft far beyond its designed limits in order to get ordnance on target. They went in close, risking ground fire and damage from the explosion of their own bombs to help their colleagues on the ground. Although they didn't face the SAMs and radar-directed AA that those going up into the northern route packs had to deal with, they also attacked from lower altitudes and often made multiple passes. And although they were not equipped for night attacks, desperate times called for desperate measures. Many squadrons had their most experienced pilots ready to go to provide support for US troops under VC attack all day long and at night. These brave and skilled flyers would try to pick out targets illuminated by flare ships, while also attempting to use their instruments to avoid hitting the ground. Day or night, having made their attacks and enjoyed a nice drink of the now melted ice water, the Hun pilots kept a watchful eye out for MiGs on the way back. If they ever spotted them, the instructions were to get low and to get supersonic. Neither the MiG-17 nor the MiG-21 were capable of following the Hun into that flight regime. So although Vietnam showed that the F-100 was not a particularly effective air-to-air fighter, it did demonstrate its ruggedness. The structure was rated for 7.33 G, which made it able to take the stresses and strains of hard maneuvering at low level. Some of the damage the aircraft came home with was startling. A D model came home with a 6-inch diameter tree trunk embedded in the wing after misjudging a pullout when low and slow over a target. An F was hit by flak and lost most of the fuselage spine. Flying alone on its mission, the damage was only noticed when the crew pulled up to fuel on a tanker. Another D suffered a gun gas explosion in its gun bay after an extended strafing run. The doors flew off and impaled themselves on the inner wing pylons. The pilot, Captain Joe Reyes, made it back alive. All this hard use was beginning to wear down the now aging fleet. In 1967, Captain Dwayne Baker was strafing a suspected VC location west of the Marine base at Chu Lai when the wings came off his aircraft during the pullout. The aircraft dived straight into the ground and Baker was killed. The crash was in a VC-infested area, so in a terrifying mission with enemy troops closing in, the party had to quickly recover Baker's body and sufficient instruments from the crashed aircraft to allow later diagnosis of what had happened. The fleet was temporarily restricted to 4G maneuvers, much to the dismay of the pilots, who now faced a choice between chancing it with the structural strength of their aircraft or being hit by ground fire. Diving angles were also restricted, reducing accuracy. Eventually, inspection of the wing boxes for fatigue led them being strengthened, and the 7.3 G limit was restored. Work to replace the wing boxes was done at a maintenance facility in Taiwan rather than in theatre. Over their service in Vietnam, the fit-out of the aircraft began to vary somewhat. Some aircraft were modified to carry the combat documentation camera pod on their centerline pylon. This pod was draggy and thus unpopular. Others carried the smaller KB-18 strike camera under the port fuselage level with the wing leading edge. The V-shaped fairing contained a revolving prism, enabling the capture of wide-angled images along the aircraft's lateral axis. The resultant photos were used for bomb damage assessment, which in some cases presumably amounted to counting matchsticks. There were numerous small runs of upgrades. For valuable missions like blind bombing based on radio triangulation to create more matchsticks, there was 1966's Combat Sky Spot program. The most significant and widespread modification, though, was the fitment of radar homing and warning gear. North Vietnam had begun to deploy the guideline SAM from April 1965, and the threat escalated thereafter. Although the F-100C and D fleet didn't venture very far north, the worry was that SAMs would proliferate to a greater degree than they in fact did. Thus, some F-100Ds were modified with the same AN/APR-24 RAW and AN/APR-26 launch warning receiver as the F-100F Wild Weasel. The modification can be identified by a pair of small spiral antennas, each one pointing out 45 degrees from the nose or tail so that they would give 360-degree coverage. Accommodating the system also meant fairly major adjustment to the cockpit equipment. The AIM-9 indicator display was removed and replaced by a set of square lights that indicated the nature of the threat. A 3-inch diameter CRT display was installed above the drag chute handle on the left front of the cockpit to show the direction of threats. In the end, this modification was reassuring to pilots who flew the modified aircraft, but it was unnecessary. No F-100 was shot down by a SAM in Vietnam, and radar-directed AAA guns were encountered only relatively rarely. Hindsight is a fine thing, though. F-100s continued to operate in Vietnam through to 1972. Attrition of the fleet was pretty severe by this point. Even so, the Air National Guard successfully operated F-100s through to 1979. Along the way, many of the Guard F-100s received more reliable afterburner eyelids for the J-57 from F-102s that were being decommissioned. These reduced the chances of the nozzle sticking partially open and reducing thrust. Some of the remaining aircraft from the 1979 lot were then expended as target drones. In all, 889 Huns were lost, the vast majority to operational accidents. 334 aircrew were killed. Sabre dances were still happening all the way to the end, even though the ANG pilots were arguably the most experienced aviators ever to fly the type, often with over 1,000 Hun hours on their logbooks. Pilots who flew it and loved it tend to agree that it was a good aircraft if you were a good pilot. Flown smoothly but decisively, particularly at slow speeds, it was a dependable ride that rewarded the pilot with its toughness and the precision with which it could place its weapons. Flown carelessly, it was a killer. Foreign buyers of the F-100 were few and far between. Killing one of the RAF's most senior pilots put a bit of a dampener on that service's potential order. Taiwan received US cast-offs, operating 110 examples of various versions until an unfortunate air crash killed most of the type's trained maintainers and led to premature retirement in 1984. Taiwanese F-100s definitely saw action, but their history unfortunately seems to be pretty poorly covered. Taiwan is the most likely place that an F-100 would have encountered the MiG-19, its closest Soviet-designed analogue. In Europe, France was the first non-US user, purchasing 100 aircraft and then using them in combat in Algeria. Their last squadrons retired the type in 1978. Denmark also got 74 Ds and Fs through military assistance and flew them into the 1980s. But the most active user of the type in combat outside the US was Turkey. Their 206 aircraft were busy in the 1974 conflict in Cyprus, and they only retired them in 1988 or 1989. Turkish Huns also had at least 3 scuffles with Soviet Su-15s in the 1970s, in which the latter were frustrated by their radar's inability to pick up F-100s as they dove to the ground to escape. One of those Huns was shot down by a SAM, however. Knowing that, it's perhaps no surprise then that the accidental or deliberately poor navigation by a Turkish F-100 led to the type's only other air-to-air engagement of note. On the 14th of September 1983, a pair of Turkish Air Force F-100Fs accidentally penetrated Iraqi airspace. A Mirage F-1EQ of the Iraqi Air Force intercepted the flight and fired at least one Super 530 at them. Given the Turkish F-100's lack of radar warning equipment that could detect the Mirage's Serrano radar's emissions, it's unlikely that their pilots knew they were being targeted. One of the F-100s was shot down and crashed in the Zako Valley near the Turkish-Iraqi border. The pilots reportedly ejected, surviving the crash, and were returned to Turkey. That incident completes the F-100's record in air-to-air combat, the successor to 2 of the finest air-to-air fighters of all time, therefore finished its career with its score at 1-1.